Great. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our class. Just a few things before we get going. This class is being recorded, and I will be sending a link to everyone who is registered. Once the recording is ready, it should eventually make its way to the BPL's YouTube page. So just be on the lookout for that. Another note, I will be sending a follow-up email to everyone once we're done, and that will include both a link to the handout and also a link to the PDF version of my slides. So you don't have to worry about, so you don't have to worry about if you missed anything, because you'll be able to see everything again. I'm sorry, and on that note, just one second, I'm going to pop in a link to the handout in the chat right now. Another note, the chat box is disabled. If you're having any issues, please type it in the Q&A box. The Q&A box will be working. So if you have any questions about my presentation or anything to do with genealogy, you can pop that into the chat box. We'll have plenty of time at the end of the presentation for questions. So first of all, we acknowledge that the Boston Public Library Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem, providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people, and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning, deliberations, and public engagement will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, free to all. There we go. Okay, so I am, hold on one second. So I am Jessie Wheeler. I am the genealogy specialist here at the BPL. I work in the research services department at the Central Library in Copley Square. There is a disco party going on in Copley Square right now, but hopefully you won't be able to hear any of that. So what we're covering today, we're gonna spend a little bit of time talking about the history of adoption in the United States. Oh, I'm sorry, I did that wrong. Okay, so the handout should be in the chat now. I am sorry about that. Clicked the wrong button. Okay, so we're going to talk about the history of adoption in the United States. Understanding the history of adoption is important, I think, to knowing how to go about researching it, because there's a lot, there's been a lot of changes in adoption. So these are things that you'll need to know in order to do your research. And we're going to go over some search tips for looking for records related to your adopted ancestors. And we're going to talk a bit about some useful records. And we're going to talk about some resources that you can use to find information, both at the BPL, from the government, and so we'll look at some websites that might be useful. Okay, so the history of adoption in the United States. We are going to be focusing solely on the United States. Just so you know, going forward, we're not going to be talking too much about, or really at all, about international adoption, just really in the United States. So before 1851, adoptions were often informal. These were not often legal arrangements. And in these cases, biological parents generally just retained their legal rights over their children, regardless of where they were living. And orphan children, so these could affect children who are orphaned or children whose biological parents couldn't care for them for whatever reason. And oftentimes what would happen is they could be bound out as indentured servants, or they could be sent to live with relatives, friends, or neighbors, and there might not have been any formal written down arrangement for this. So that can make looking for people before this time, it can be kind of hard to figure out why they were living, with whom they were living, if there was no legal adoption. There were legal adoptions back then, but a lot of adoptions were informal. There weren't a lot of laws governing it back then. So as we were just saying, so these arrangements there were not always recorded. They just kind of happened. You got sent away to live somewhere, and then that was it. The legal adoptions that did happen, those are processed through the state legislature. So if it was legal adoption, you need to go to the records or the archives for whatever state legislature you're dealing with. So for Massachusetts, that would be the Massachusetts General Court. And we're going to talk a bit about historical adoption records from the state later. One way that you could tell that someone might have been adopted would be records of name changes. Name changes were recorded and published fairly regularly in the early 19th century. These name change books would occasionally note that the child was adopted, and that was the reason for the name change. That is not always the case, though, and you shouldn't necessarily assume that just because it's not noted that the person was adopted and that's why the name is changing, that they weren't adopted. They could have been adopted. They just may not have been noted in the book. So why we chose 1851 for the cutoff year, that is when the Massachusetts Adoption of Children Act was passed. This is the first modern adoption law to be passed in the United States. Up until that time, there really were no laws in the United States regulating adoption. This moved the responsibility for legal adoptions to probate courts as opposed to the state legislature. So after 1851, you're going to want to go to the probate courts, and we will talk a little bit about that later. The other thing that this act did was give authority to a judge to determine if the adoption was quote unquote fit and proper. What constituted fit and proper was entirely up to the judge. There were no qualifications or standards laid out. It was just up to the judge to decide if this was okay. The other major thing that this did was terminate the legal rights of the biological parents whose children were adopted. At this point forward, their legal rights were terminated. They were no longer their parents. They had no rights over these children. That was one of the major things this act did. The other thing that it did which was also pretty major, was that it established the right of adopted children to inherit from their adopted parents. Before this time, if someone died intestate and they had an adopted child, their adopted child would not get anything. If there was no will, they were not legally entitled to inherit anything. And even if they were named in a will from an adopted parent, the biological children could contest it, and it was very easy to say, well, you don't have a legal right, so you don't get to inherit anything. So this was really huge, that now established that adopted children were children of the parents and they could inherit from them. The other thing that this changed was that it required that children age 14 and over, they also had to consent to the adoption. So this gave the teenagers who were being adopted a little bit more agency to decide where, if they wanted to be adopted by this person. So this is a really big change. So Massachusetts was just the first state to have an adoption act like this. The law was copied by many other states in the country, and now every state has adoption related laws on the books. So the other major thing, which a lot of folks may have heard about, were the orphan trains. These were in operation from 1854 to 1929. So what happened was about 250,000 children were taken on trains from East Coast cities, primarily New York, but Boston as well. They would be placed with families throughout the rest of the U.S., United States, and sometimes Canada, and it would primarily be out in the Midwest, in the pioneer states, in the frontier. Though these children were not necessarily true orphans, even though they were on the orphan train. They could have been placed on the trains because they were homeless, because their biological parents died, because their biological parents were either unable or unwilling to take care of them, or they were placed in an orphanage by their biological parents because of financial or other hardships. Now, these were cases where the biological parents may have intended to get their life in order, find work, and make enough money so that they could reclaim their child. These were parents that they intended to come back for their child, but in these cases, they often never saw their child again. There are some famous cases that you can read about in various books about this, about parents, mostly mothers, contacting these orphanages over and over again, trying to find out where their children are because they could take care of them now. There was one case where a woman, she was poor, her husband had died, and she placed her child in an orphanage because she couldn't afford to take care of them. She got married, was in a much better position, and she wanted to get her child back. Her child was sent in an orphan train, and she was never told what happened to her. She kept writing to them, and they never told her what happened. So the orphan trains are somewhat controversial now. It's not generally considered to be a great thing. The other issue with this is many of the children were not treated as children, despite the fact that they were technically adopted. A lot of these children were treated as free labor. Essentially, the adults would go to a place in town when the train pulled in. It was usually a church, and they were considered to be farm labor. So this is not always the case. There were some children who were adopted and treated as, natural children, but it wasn't always the case. So there were a lot of problems with this system, and it could be very traumatizing for entire families when this happened. So going forward into the 20th century, kind of overlapping with the orphan train era, in 1917, Minnesota passed the Minnesota Adoption Act. So this is the first law that requires an investigation prior to placing an adopted child into a new home, and established the requirement that adoption records need to be kept confidential. So this, like I said, they were the first state to do this. Before this, there really wasn't much of any supervision of where the child went. There could be a lot of problems with this. There's a famous case in New York City where a girl was placed in a home where she was abused really terribly, and there was no recourse for anyone to save her. And it wound up the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals finally did something and saved and got her out of there. This is and that was only just one such incident, and this law was kind of spurred on by that, trying to prevent children from being abused in homes that they were placed in. Going further along into the mid 20th century, also in Minnesota, there's the first recorded transracial adoption. This is when a white family adopted an African American child. This is the first recorded instance of this. There were, of course, probably other more informal instances of transracial adoption, but this is the first one that we know of, and it was, again, in Minnesota. After this, wasn't terribly common in the 1940s, but nowadays it is quite, a lot more common for white families to adopt the children of color. So it is a lot more common now, and this is the first one that was recorded. So getting into the late 20th century, into the early 21st century, in 1994, there's a federal law passed called the U.S. Multi-Ethnic Placement Act. And this law is the first one related to race and adoption to be passed, and it prohibited adoption agencies that receive federal funds from denying adoptions due solely to race. And it was amended a couple years later to prohibit race as a consideration factor when placing children for adoption or foster care. So before that, there was a bit of discrimination. I mean, the system is still not perfect, but this at least made it a crime to do that if you got federal funding. In 1998, Oregon passes ballot measure 58. So this allowed adult adoptees to access their original birth certificates. So this goes back to the one law that was passed, which made those records secret, which is still the case in many states. This is a battle that is, currently being fought by open adoption advocates, adoptees seeking information about their biological parents. And this was something that was still fought. There were several legal challenges that failed, and it finally took effect about 2 years after it was passed, and it's still in effect. So Oregon is was the first state to do something like this, and it's still kind of rare. There's a lot of states that have passed similar measures, and a lot of states have similar measures under consideration right now. There are still a lot of restrictions regarding access to adoption records in this country. In the year 2000, another federal law was passed, the U.S. Child Citizenship Act. So this this established the automatic granting of citizenship to foreign-born adopted and biological children of U.S. citizens upon their arrival in the United States. Before this, the parent would have to request citizenship on behalf of their child, or the child would have to, try to get citizenship once they were an adult. So this made it automatic. There were some exceptions earlier on, for instance, if you had refugee status, various other issues, but this basically made it automatic. Any adopted or biological child of a United States citizen born outside the United States automatically became a citizen once they entered the United States. So this affected not just adopted children, but children living with their biological parents as well. Okay. So that's just a little bit of the history of adoption in the United States. It's not comprehensive by any means. There's a lot more that you could look into, but so that's just a brief overview of the important pieces of legislation that you need to kind of know of if you're doing research into adopted ancestors. So now we're going to talk about some search tips. So because of the restriction to adoption records, there's a lot of, you're going to have to kind of go around it and try to find information in other ways, particularly if you're researching someone who lives in a state that still has restricted access to adoption records. So one of the best things you can do is join an online community that focuses on adoption research. In communities like this, you'll have people who are doing the same kind of research, who have been through it themselves, and they could have advice for you, be a sounding board, just be someone you can bounce things off of, and they could be able to help. They might be able to tell you where you could go or who you could talk to that could help you. Another big step you could do is register on an adoption reunion registry. There are many of these throughout the country. There are some states that have their own that are run by the state, and there are a lot of private ones. So we're going to look at some of the ways to find those in a little bit, but these are really good ways to put your name out there and say who you're looking for and see if that person is also looking for you. You can connect that way. The other thing you need to consider, which we have mentioned already, is I gave you a history, is to think about the time period that the adoption may have occurred. So if you are researching an ancestor from longer ago that was adopted, it might have been an informal arrangement, in which case there won't be any records, and you kind of have to use other clues to try to figure out where they were. There are a lot of instances where children will just show up in things like census records, and they may or may not be referred to as adopted. They might say they were adopted, but it was never formalized, but that's just what they told the census taker when they came in. I have noticed a few incidences like this where there may or may not have been any formal record, but it was in the census. So then that's how you can tell what their relationship was. Just one moment. Excuse me. So the other thing you can do, research, particularly if you're looking for folks that are from the 19th century or early 20th century, is look into the ancestors' adoptive parents. This can be especially useful early on, because in a lot of cases in the late 19th, early 20th century, they were very likely related in some way or have some kind of shared relationship with the biological parents. They could have been, it was often happened where it could have been they were a sibling of a biological parent. So they could have been adopted by their aunts or uncles or a cousin, or in some cases, grandparents. So you can look into them and see were they in some way connected to the biological parents, and you can try to find out that way. Other thing you can do is, which is why I keep emphasizing the history of adoption, look into the history of where your adopted ancestor was from. This can be especially useful if there were any children's charities or orphanages active in the area. For instance, there were several such places in big cities. So there are lots of places like this in like Chicago, New York, Boston. So if you know there were any organizations that dealt with orphans or handled adoptions, it's good for you to know what those places were. Other thing, one of the big things you need to do is look at every kind of record you can find, even ones that may not have an obvious connection to adoption. For instance, earlier we were discussing name change books. So it's one thing that's not directly related to adoption, but could have information on adoption. Name change might denote an adoption. So like with a lot of genealogy research, if it's especially a hard question you're looking into, look at everything you possibly can. And we're going to talk about some of those records later. So once you exhaust paper records, things you can find online, if this is a closer relationship, like if you're looking for someone who's only a couple generations removed from you, you should consider using DNA testing in addition to traditional research. And this can be most useful if you take multiple tests and use a lot of different sites and have as many of your relatives take them as you can. These are the sorts of things that, again, we don't know. I personally don't know a lot about this sort of thing, so you might need to contact a specialist in this sort of thing. There are a lot of professional genealogists who specialize in DNA testing, so you could definitely contact someone like that. This is kind of a last resort sort of thing. There have been a lot of cases where people found their biological parents or determined that there was an adoption in their ancestry because of DNA testing. DNA testing has led to the revelation of a lot of things that were supposed to be secret these days, including adoptions. And another thing that can be very useful to do is reach out to the experts. There are adoption search coordinators, some of which are employed by governments. So this is what they do. They try to facilitate reunions between biological and adopted people, between adoptees and their biological family. You can contact state and judicial archivists to see what records that they have that might be useful. And also you need to look at people who are familiar with register of deeds and or probate. These are the sorts of things that could mention adopted children, and we will talk about that in a little bit. Other thing that's very, very important, make sure you know what the applicable laws relating to adoption records in the area you're researching and what you're legally allowed to request. This is very important. The laws vary from state to state. Every state has its own laws on who can access what adoption records from what time period. So it's really, really important that you know what the laws are in this place you're researching. So going on to some of the records that might be useful that you possibly may not have thought of. So cemetery records, which may not have thought of as being useful for this. Burial records kept by cemeteries could include some detailed information about the family of the deceased, especially if they're buried in a family plot that could contain information about their children or any adopted relatives in there. As I was mentioning before, census records. These could indicate adoption in relation to the head of the household. So from 1880 onwards, the census records listed everyone in a household, and the head of household was listed first, and then it listed everyone else, and then it's listed how everyone else was related to the head of household. So the most common relationships you see in there is wife, son, daughter. A lot of time you'll see in-laws, brother-in-law, boarder, and then at some point they also would include adopted son. I've actually seen also in a few cases where there's multiple generations of family living in one place, adopted grandson, adopted niece, adopted nephew. So from 1880 onward, if you're looking around that time period, you can possibly find an indication of adoption in the census. Church records are also kind of an unexpected resource. These things could be noted in a baptism record. If a family was baptizing a child that they adopted, that could include information in there that the child was adopted. And depending on the community you were in, if it was a close-knit community and the biological parents were still somewhat involved in the child's life, it could include who the biological parents were in addition to the adoptive parents. Church records can oftentimes be a useful source of information, particularly if you're researching an area where official government records are sparse due to things like fires or poor record retention practices, or just they haven't kept any records. So church records are very, very useful. Another big resource, and this is helpful if you have relatives who have kept large collections of these things, family papers. So this could include letters, diaries, and another big resource, family Bibles. A lot of family Bibles would include a section specifically for noting births, deaths, marriages, things like that. And they might also include whether or not someone was adopted. So if you have a relative or if you have a collection of this sort of thing, these can be really, really helpful because you're hearing it basically straight from the horse's mouth, talking about how such and such was adopted. Immigration records can be really important. This is specifically for children who are adopted internationally. There's going to be a lot of paperwork on things like this. If the child was adopted, there's going to be lots of records, especially if you're coming from the time period where they didn't automatically get citizenship. Then they would have to be naturalized. So you could also see that in naturalization records. Another big source of these types of records are going to be institutional records. So this includes things like orphanages, which we've already mentioned, and those could also be foundling hospitals, other hospitals, and different charitable organizations. A lot of these organizations, they're either still around in some form or fashion, or their records were donated to an archive of some sort. I believe Boston University, has the Boston Medical Center's records. So don't quote me on that, though. I don't know that off the top of my head, but a lot of these institutions, their records are still out there. And if you're able to access them, this could include valuable information about adoptions, or particularly in the cases of when children were sent on the orphan trains. There are several books and things that were kept on all the names of children who were sent away on these trains and when they were sent out and where they wound up. Because these places were supposed to follow up generally with the orphans after they were placed. So there might be some records on what their new names were or things like that. So those can be really helpful, especially if you're looking for orphan train ancestors. Military records can be very helpful, particularly if someone during active military service, if they adopted a child, because again, the government was more heavily involved. There's going to be a lot of paperwork on that. It will probably be noted in the personnel file. And something we already kind of talked about were name change books. So these are things we're going to just head on over to the mass.gov for a bit. There's quite a collection of these related to Massachusetts. So these are before 1852. This will just be adoption before 1852. They could be noted in the name change books. So these things, we're going to take a look at one of these in a little bit. It'll have the person's original name, their new name, and when the date of the change, and also the chapter number of the legislative statute. Because again, these were adoptions before 1852 were handled by the state legislature. So there'll be something in the Massachusetts Acts and Resolves related to the name change and the adoption. Another useful resource are newspapers, and not necessarily in more modern times, but around 19th century. These things they would include announcements of children that were available for adoption. And later on in the early 20th century, there will be announcements in the probate court of formal adoptions. This is before adoption records were sealed automatically in a lot of jurisdictions. So if you're looking in that time period of the early modern era, that will newspapers will possibly have announcements of this, and then you can track that down that way. I've seen a couple of these where will say that such and such has adopted the child of such and such, and it's usually a lot of the times it happens that it was a father whose wife had died and you couldn't take care of the children. It was fairly common for widowed fathers to place their children with someone else because it was kind of not really done for single fathers to take care of their children in a lot of cases. So that was a relatively common occurrence. Okay. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, probate records. So that includes wills, things like wills. You could see someone might have mentioned, to my adopted son, to my adopted daughter, I leave such and such amount of money or object, and so that we'll note it that way. There are also things like guardianship records. So if it was not a formalized adoption, if they were a legal guardian, that could include something. Trust records and anything to do with a person's estate could very well have information about an adopted child or other adopted relative that was involved in the estate. Another useful thing would be published genealogies. So published genealogies, these are books that are generally written by a member of a particular family who've done research on their ancestry. These are laid out with, the person's name, birth and death dates, and in some cases, longer entries that will give you a little narrative of the person's life. And things like this could, much like a family letter or diary, contain, they adopted such and such around such and such a time. This can also be pretty handy. Also, vital records. Again, you're kind of looking at these in areas where they're more open or before their adoption records were sealed. Adoptions could have been noted on a birth record, particularly if the child was adopted at or shortly after birth. So this is kind of a bit of a gray area nowadays, and that's kind of a battle in some jurisdictions about access to these records, but these can be places where you can find information about adoptees. Okay, so we've talked about some of the records that you can use, and now we can talk about how you can find some of these records in some available resources. So through the BPL, we have a few different databases that you could look at. There is American Ancestors, which you can only use at the Central Library. This has several different databases. So if we go into search there, let's see if we can get, there we go. So they have a lot of things so they have the New England Historic Genealogical Register, which includes a lot of family genealogies, so that they could mention adoptions there. They have baptism records, a lot of different kinds of church records. They have the genealogy pages for the Boston Evening Transcript, a lot of different random things that could possibly mention adoption. Along those lines, we also have Ancestry Library Edition, which I mentioned a lot, which is basically the kind of the big one as far as researching anything to do with genealogy. There's, again, much like in American Ancestors, there's a lot of different types of things that you can find in here. So there's some immigration records, there's military records, and there's birth, marriage, and death records, and there's the census. So as we mentioned before, these are all types of records that could possibly have information about adoptees. And also, one we don't talk about a lot is Archive Grid. Okay, and that is apparently not working for us right now. Let's see if we can get into it another way. I'm gonna have to fix that link later. Okay, so Archive Grid is basically what it sounds like. It's a listing of different kinds of archives. There we go, they changed the URL on me. So this is a good place to go if you're looking for things like institutional records, which we looked at before. You can see who has record collections. So for instance, let's try Boston Medical Center. Okay, so you can see where these are mentioned, anything related. So there we go. So there's The big one that comes up is the Boston Public Health Commission board records. So they were obviously involved with it. So this is just a good resource to find if you're looking for hospital records, orphanage records, charitable society records. This would be a good place to search for them and see where they might be. We also at the BPL have a lot of books on this subject. So this is, again, if you're interested in more general history type things. It's just, oops, there we go. So we have a few books on history. Some of these are going to include more personal stories. Some of them are going to be more general history. So included are, we have a couple books on orphan trains. I've read both of these. They're both very informative. I definitely recommend it if you're just interested in learning more about the orphan trains. And we also have books about the history of international and transracial adoption. Again, if this is a subject area that you're interested in, they might also include information about how the process works, so that can give you an idea of how you can go about researching it yourself. And there's also, we have a lot of links to US government resources. So this is going to include, come on now, things in various languages. So we have a lot here in Spanish. These are going to be, information about prospective adopted parents. A lot of these are digitized that you can look at online. So the federal government produces a lot of things online now. So this will be a good way to look at stuff like that. So this is useful if you're involved in, if you're interested in looking into adoption currently. So as we mentioned before, there's things called adopt search registries. So the website Gene Search has a listing of all of these places organized by state. So some of these are going to be run by official government agencies. So for instance, in Arkansas, they have a whole part of their website and their Department of Health for adoption file requests that goes into how that works. So these will be links to registries, information about how to request records, all organized by state. You can see in Massachusetts, we're going to look at this quickly. So Massachusetts, that'll give you information about how to find that there. So it's a pretty handy list of links there, so you can get a better idea of how it works in which state, so you can get more information about what could be available depending on what you're looking at. So we're going to take a look at a name change book, so you can get a little bit of an idea of what it looked like. So let's go into full screen here. Okay, so there we go. So it really is, it can be kind of difficult to parse here. Let's make it a little bit bigger. There we go. So there we go. So these are not necessarily going to be adoption here. I just picked this page at random so you can see here, for instance, this one. You see this person is changing his last name from Gallup to Marsdale. And also his wife and his children are also changing their names. So basically this is what it was, saying such and such of whatever city or town may take whatever name. So here you see Carlos Whiting Jr. of Rentham may take the name of Gustavus H. Whiting. So they're changing their first name. So that's basically how it is. It's essentially just a list of names, and it is organized by year. So this page in particular is from 1847. So these are what the name change books look like for that year. Depending on what you're looking at, it might be a little different. So this year is organized by county. So you can see here, so this is 1864. These are lists for Franklin County. So this will list their date of the change, the original name, and the name it was changed to. Not there. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, goodness. Be quiet, be quiet, be quiet. I am sorry about that. Okay, where did we leave off? Okay. Should learn to look before I click. Okay, I think this is where we are. Okay, let's speed along here. There we go. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, so we did already take a look at from mass.gov access to adoption records. So this is how this page will give you some information about how to get records from probate and family courts. So the state also has a site about how to access historic adoption records. So historic is considered, so these are things basically anyone can get them. They're not really restricted. It's well past the loophole of the ones that are restricted in Massachusetts. So this will give you some information about how to get these records in the state. And the state archives also has a page of information about how to find adoption records. So this is just, kind of going over what we were already talking about the law and a little bit of information about that. So the federal government, childwelfare.gov, which is a division of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, they have a lot of information here about search and reunion. So this is again for currently, if you're looking for a biological parent or an adopt or biological child, anything along those lines. It's going to be some good information about how to navigate the system and how to find what you're looking for depending on what state you're in. There's also from a company called Research Etc. Incorporated, there's even more listings of state programs and registries. So, and this will also tell you if there's a state agency involved, it'll tell you what the name of the agency and what they do. Okay, so outside of the government, there's a few more useful websites. So I don't know how many of you have heard of Cindy's List, but it's basically, if you remember the old Yahoo directories, it's basically that, but for genealogy. So what she has done is compile a list of links on related topics, on specific topics in genealogy. So she has a section on adoption records. So if we were to look at this, research services. So this would be a link to different agencies that can help you research adoption. Also, Find My Past, which is a paid site, which we do not subscribe to, but they have in their free section in their blog. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, they have a blog entry about advice on researching adoption records. And also free from American Ancestors. You do have to register for an account, but it is free. This does focus on people of Jewish heritage, if this will ever vote for me. They have their own digital library online, which is free and open, and it is taking an awful long time to come up today. Okay, so that doesn't seem to be working for us right now, but basically it's a digitized collections. Oh, there we go. So it's digitized materials from different repositories. It's from the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center, the Arstein and Avery Special Collections, and then New England Historic Genealogical Society's research library. So there's things like letters, diaries, photographs, genealogies, directories, business records, all digitized and all of which you can browse. And let me see, and it is accessible with a, yeah, so these actually do not require an account. So there are some collections that don't require any account. You can just go ahead and look at them. These are the open access things. Some of them are restricted, but there's quite a lot here. This section here at the top is completely open. You don't need to have an account. Along the genealogy database with free sections line, ancestry.com, which is a website we do have access to at the BPL. They also have a free section with different articles about various genealogy related topics. And they also have a section on how to find adoption and orphanage records. And it is annoying right now. I am not having good luck with these sites tonight. There we go. So basically, it'll give you some information about how to search for different types of records and then send you a link to look at them within their site. You do, if you're using our subscription for this, you do need to be in the building to do that, and at a BPL location to do that. If you have your own subscription, you can just do it right from home. There's again also if you're researching an orphan train participant or just interested about it, there is a museum for this, and they do have a library, so they have a lot of information about it. So you can take a look at their history. They have a very detailed history on here with a bunch of different sections. You can even read, there are some accounts here from people who from children who were placed on orphan trains, who their stories were recorded, so you can get an idea of what it was like for them. And there's also a free website, familysearch.org, which is basically like Wikipedia, but for genealogy, and they have a section on adoption. Those will be a list of links to useful websites, and there's a section organized by state and further information if you're interested in reading more about it. All right, so we've come to the end of my prepared presentation. So now we are going to look at some questions. I'm going to again pop a link to the handout in our chat for anyone who came in a little later. Okay, so we have a few things in here already. Let me see. Okay, so Talisha is asking, are these same techniques able to be used when researching family trees for people that aren't adopted, for example, foundational Black Americans that are descendants of American US slavery? So no, they're not really related. This talk was focused on specifically if you're researching adoption. There could be some overlap in some areas, but researching African American ancestors who were enslaved, that is a much different topic. If you have any questions on that, definitely feel free to shoot us an email if you're looking for something specific, and then we can get back to you. Okay, so Melora is asking, what about the Indian Child Welfare Act? So that's again another issue that is a little tougher to deal with. There are, again, I don't have a lot of expertise in regards to Native Americans or the Indian Child Welfare Act. That wasn't really so much related to adoption. That was a forced removal and assimilation. So it was kind of a stain on our history. That's not necessarily adoption per se. But again, if you have any, if you have a specific question, if you're researching someone, again, feel free to send us an email and then we can look into that for you. Okay, so someone was also asking, what is the best way to get records from orphanages? So like I just said, you can use, I recommend using Archive Grid and typing in the name of the place and seeing what is out there. If you're not sure where your ancestor might have been, you can look at a city directory. For instance, the Boston city directories, for instance, would always list. They would be listed under the charitable organizations, all the different orphanages, so you can see what existed, what institution they might have been at. Do a search on Archive Grid. You can also try doing a search on Google. There are a lot of finding aids out there, for instance, for colleges that are discoverable online that are relatively easy to stumble on. So you can try that. But it really depends on, this is, of course, if these records were saved. Not all of these places saved their records. So that's something you really need to keep in mind. This will only work if the records still exist. If you can't find any collections of records, or if you've done all this research, if you've tried looking online, if you've tried looking at Archive Grid, it might just be that these records were not kept. This could be particularly true if it was not run by a church or a government. They might not have kept any records, or they might have been lost or destroyed. So basically, like I said, try searching online, try searching Archive Grid. Okay, let's see. So someone's asking how to access the recording. So In case you missed it at the beginning, this will eventually wind up on our YouTube page. I'll have to wait till it's processed and I can get our lovely folks in AV to upload it to YouTube. They are very, very busy, so I can't tell you when specifically that will come up, but when the recording is ready, I will send a link to everyone who is registered so they can watch that recording up on YouTube. So like, again, I don't know when that will be. Our AV department has to do that. I can't do that myself. So we have to wait until they are able to do that. Because like I said, they are very, very busy. We have a lot of programming going on that they have to be involved in, but I will send everyone an email once it is ready. Okay, let's see. So Linda's asking what would be good sources to learn the laws related to adoption of a particular state. I'm interested in New York specifically. Are there specific books, for example, you would recommend? So I don't know of any specific books off the top of my head. So for New York, what I would do is start off with the state library. They could probably tell you, more about the state laws in New York and legislative history in New York. They might have something on their website. I'm not sure if they do, like Massachusetts does, but I always start with the library and the place you're looking at. If you know in what particular county or town you're looking into, you can also try a library there. So that's something I really highly recommend, contacting the library where you're at. So for New York, I would try the New York State Library. I believe they also have a section on genealogy research on their website. So they do have a genealogy section, so I would contact them. Let me see if I can find that on here for you. Okay, yes, there it is. Okay, so I'm going to pop this link into the chat for you. So this is the New York State Library's genealogy section. So I would start by contacting them. Okay, so Leanne's asking, how would I find name changes in South Carolina and Georgia? So again, I don't really have a level of expertise in that. So let me see what I can find here. Let's see. Oops, no, it's not there. So I'm not really sure where you would go about finding that. So again, let me see. So South Carolina also has a state library. Let me see if they have a genealogy section. Oh, they do. Okay, so I'm going to pop in another link for you. So this is the research guide from the South Carolina State Library for Genealogy. So let's see, what about Georgia? Let me see. Records. Okay. So again, yeah, probably the Georgia State Library. So definitely, I know I'm a little biased, but again, I highly recommend if you're researching a particular place, contact the library there. So they don't appear, oh, they do have a, okay, now that is, okay, so let me see. Oh, State Archives, there we go. Okay, so for Georgia, it looks like you actually, okay, so I'm going to give you two links here for Georgia. So there's the Georgia State Archives and the Georgia State Library, if I can find that again. Okay, so yeah, I would actually, for Georgia, I would actually start with the state archives. They don't appear to have a single state library like we do, like they do out in New York. So that's what I would say. Definitely start off with them. So Linda's asking, do you have the PDF version of your presentation? Yes, I will be sending everyone a link to download that once we are done. So shortly after we're finished here, I will be sending you all a link to that. So yes, you will be getting that. So, and also in our wrap-up email, in case you missed it in the chat, there will be a link to download the handout as well. And the handout and the PDF presentation will have all of the links that we looked at in my presentation today. Okay, so we still have a little time. So if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box. So we're just gonna give everyone a few more minutes here. So there's a few people with your hands up. So if those of you who have your hands up, if you had any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. This is a webinar format, so I can't let you turn your mic. You won't be able to have your mic on. So if you have a question, type them to the Q&A box. They've got plenty of time. Okay, so someone's asking what would be for the Ohio and Pennsylvania State Library. Okay, let me see what I can find out. Ohio State. Okay, so looks like the State Library of Ohio has a genealogy archive, so that's excellent. All right, so that's awesome. So here's a link. There's Ohio, and let's see, Pennsylvania. Let's see what they have. Okay, so they also have a genealogy and local history section. So that was excellent. All right, and there's Pennsylvania. So in general, if you're doing this kind of research and you're not sure about where to contact in a state, you can, again, I'm just typing all these things into Google. What you can just try typing in is the state you're looking for and adoption records, or in this case, I was typing in the state and library and genealogy and seeing what we come up with. So in some cases, it might be like Georgia, you might need to go to the state archives. They might be the ones that have this kind of information. So that's just, it's a really quick, simple Google search. So you can find things like this if you're not sure. Okay, so we've got a few more minutes. So one thing can talk about, so this is the last class for the spring. We will be coming back in the fall. I believe we don't have anything firmly scheduled yet, so keep an eye on our website for news about the classes. And I would encourage you, if you have any ideas for future classes, please feel free to include those in the survey that you're going to get once we close out of here. We'd always like to know what people want to know more about. Okay, let's see. Oh, that's excellent. Okay, so it's a colorful URL, so I'm just going to warn you all. So Jim has provided a link to another overview of state laws, so I'm going to pop that into the chat box. Thank you, Jim. There we go. That is excellent. Okay, so I will also be sending everyone, once we're done here, I will send everyone a link to the chat transcript so that you will be able to get right away. So if you miss one of the links we put up here, I will also be sending that to you in my wrap-up email this evening. So you don't have to worry about missing any of those. All right, so as I was saying, so that's so this is our last class for the spring. We'll be coming back in the fall. Feel free, if you have any thoughts on what kind of class offerings you'd like to see, you can feel free to add that to the survey or send us an email. We will definitely consider it. Like I said, we like to know what people are interested in learning about. And our last genealogy, our last family history lecture for the year will be on June 29th. Then we're going to have some speakers from the Leventhal Map Center here at the VPL. talking about how to use maps in the family research. So there'll be a link to that for more information about that and to register also in our wrap-up email. All right, so if no one has any further questions, I'm gonna go ahead and close out now. I want to thank everyone for coming. I hope you found this interesting, and we're looking forward to coming back in the fall with more classes. They will hopefully be online. I don't know if we're going to be doing in-person or hybrid, but we will definitely have an online presence, whether it's hybrid or solely on June online. No, I do not have a newsletter. Someone's asking if we have a newsletter. No, we don't. That's a great idea, though. I'll definitely look into that and talk to my boss about that. That would be kind of fun, actually. So if anyone's interested in seeing anything like that, or again, please feel free to send me an email or put a note in the survey. So that is an excellent suggestion, whoever put that in. Okay, so good night, everyone. Thank you for coming. I hope you all have an excellent weekend. Oh, Eileen's asking, yes, this was recorded, just in case you missed it. I will, once this is up on our YouTube page, I will be sending everyone who's registered a link to this, a link to the recording on YouTube, so you can watch it there. I can't tell you when that will be. I have to wait for our AV department to upload it, so that can kind of take a while because they're very, very busy and understaffed, as we all are these days. So, but once that is ready, I will send it right out to everyone. So, and if you don't get it, if you might have made a typo in your email, just definitely send me an email and I can send that to you once it's ready if you think you might have typed your email in wrong, because that does sometimes happen. Okay, so we are going to wrap up for the evening. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Again, have a good weekend and have a good summer. Bye-bye.